this next chapter that we're going to try to accomplish today is the 8th chapter, and it is entitled Pesticide Handling Decisions. And we're to the point in the classwork and the discussion that we begin to wear a little different hat, so to speak. We're going to be talking about the things that you consider when you're making the decision of what chemicals to use. From a management standpoint, there are a lot of factors that we look at when we're making those decisions, and we're going to talk about a few of those today. There are, with this, a list of terms, just like there are with most of these chapters. But we have covered the majority of these terms in the previous 7 chapters. I'm going to scan right through them right quickly and give you a chance to think about and make sure that you understand what those terms are, because there's we need to have that understanding as we move forward. The first one in that list is an adjuvant. That's one of the terms that was on the test that we had, but that's a substance that's added to a pesticide formulation or a tank mix to increase its effectiveness or safety. If you're washing dishes at home and you're using warm water, just warm water, the dishwashing soap, the Joy or whatever that you put in that water to facilitate that cleaning process is in effect an adjuvant. It aids in the cleaning of that. And there are lots of different types of adjuvants that are used in chemical formulations or chemical tank mixes to make the mix, spray, more effective or easier to use or safer. And they can be things, something as simple as the Joy that we just talked about. And we've probably, I don't know whether I've used this example in here or not, because I use it a lot in different classes. But if you ever sprayed water on a cabbage leaf?
Yeah.
Just tried to spray cabbage? What'd it do?
Beat it up.
It just beat up and run off, right? So if you put some Joy or one of the chemical formulations that we used was a compound called Tween 20. That's an old one. They've got all sorts of other surfactants that they're used. But when you put that in the water and spray the cabbage, then it's going to reduce the surface tension or the ability that cabbage has to repel the water. Instead of that beating up and being a big droplet, it'll flatten that droplet out and it'll begin to wet that cabbage. So that's an example of an adjuvant. It's just one of the many things. As far as an adjuvant that would increase the safety of a material, sometimes we're using things that tend to be somewhat volatile. In other words, get caught up in the air and create potential hazards from the drift. And there are materials that we can put in a tank mix that will reduce the drift of certain chemicals. In the area where you guys are in Southside, I'm sure there's been a herbicide called Command used early in the spring to reduce the weed populations in tobacco fields. But Command is an extremely volatile material, and when it first came out, anybody that was selling Command had to go to a training session. I went to one down near Charlotte to be able to gain the ability to sell Command to some of the tobacco farmers I was working with. But in that training session, they said you can't use Command unless you provide or require that the purchaser by an anti-drift agent. Apparently that's not the case now because there's some farmers that crop tobacco on the route that I take coming down here. And every spring, after they put in their tobacco, a week or 10 days, 2 weeks, a month afterwards, the leaves on the trees surrounding the fields where they spray that tobacco turn white. And that's the visual sign that there was drift from command. Command is a chemical that reduces the chlorophyll content in those leaves. And instead of them being green, on the side facing that tobacco field, they're as white as the sheets of paper that you guys got on your desk. On the other side of the tree, where it wasn't exposed to that drift coming across, they're the normal green color. So another adjuvant that we're talking about are drift agents. There are all sorts of different things that are available in the chemical industry now to perform these various niche type functions that are needed as we begin to make our handling decisions. So an adjuvant is it's just an ever-encompassing term for substances that are used to either increase the effectiveness or siphon different chemical combinations. Agitation is the next term that's talked about. And I'm sure all of you have been agitated some time during the day. Amanda was agitated this morning when she came in. We had to talk about that a little bit. But the agitation we're talking about with chemicals is a constant mixing. It's a stirring. A lot of the spray tanks will either have a mechanical agitation in them, which is quite often a shaft that goes through the tank with a couple of paddles on it that actually stirs the material. If the machine is not equipped with that, it's going to have another hose, for lack of a better way to describe it, that comes in the bottom of the tank that gets part of the bypass pressure from the tank. And that will be a constant flow of additional liquid going through the tank that provides a positive pressure and stirs it, very much like you stir your tea with your spoon. So we talked about chemical resistance. That's the ability to prevent the movement of a pesticide through a material during a period of use. Chemical resistance we talked a little bit about with the PPE that we talked about last time. So concentrates are pesticides that are relatively high percentage of the active ingredient. Not rocket science. Decontamination or decontaminate is to remove from an exposed surface or organism to prevent further harm or damage. Y'all have all seen decontamination things when you see it on TV in some sort of way.
Sprays.
Do what?
Some decontaminant spray showers.
Yeah, all of that type stuff, you know. But if you've got on your PPE, your gloves and your boots, you want to physically decontaminate that by washing it off in some way. There are ways to do that that are approved, and other ways are not. So, a diluent is any substance used to dilute a pesticide. To dilute means to make it less concentrated. We talked about drift a while ago. That's the movement of pesticide away from a release site in the air. That's what we're talking about with drift. Now we're going to talk about runoff in a little bit, but that's totally different. Drift is in the air, where runoff is going to be a movement away in water. Exposed or exposure is contacting or touching with a pesticide a surface of an organism. Exposures can be oral, inhaled, dermal, which means on your skin, or ocular, which means in your eye. The term formulation, that's one that quite often confuses people. But formulation is the pesticide product as it is sold. And it is usually a mixture of active and inert ingredients. And I use my favorite complaint when we go to talking about formulations. Roundup is one of the ones that's most highly advertised that you guys would have some knowledge of. And formulations of Roundup vary dramatically. You'll go into Home Depot or Lowe's or any of the big box stores, Southern States, any of them, and you'll see Roundup in a ready-to-use container. Quite often it's a little squirt bottle. And it says, kills all grasses and weeds. And that is usually a 1% formulation of Roundup. And I don't recommend to you that you ever buy it that way because it's so terribly expensive. You're paying an awful lot for a bottle of water. You've only got 1 ounce of active ingredient Roundup, which is 41.9% Roundup, glyphosate. You got 1 ounce in a gallon of water, but more than likely you're only buying about a pint. But they're going to charge you an enormous price for that, for the water in the little squirt bottle. You'll see Roundup also offered in maybe quarts, sometimes in half gallons, that says concentrated Roundup. You read the label on that. Concentrated Roundup in this situation is 18%. True, it is more concentrated than that 1% that was available, but still it's less than half strength because the original Roundup is 41.9. But that's the retail product that these people provide. And it's I haven't priced any of it this year. Normally it's anywhere from 18 to 20 bucks for say a half a gallon of 18%.
A question regarding concentration. Would it be a mistake to assume that the more concentrated the solution is, the more effective it is in some cases?
I'll go back to Dwayne's response to that. It depends, Tyler. It depends totally on the material and the usage and things of that type. So that's a general statement, but you got to qualify it a little bit.
Okay. If I sprayed something with 100% Roundup solution as opposed to the 45%, would there be any real difference?
You can't get 100% Roundup solution.
Cannot?
41, well, the general Roundup that was first patented was a 41.9%. They have since come out with one that's, I believe, 48%. In other words, they've taken a little bit of the water out of it. But to my knowledge, that is the strongest concentration of Roundup that is available. That you got, say, 48% of that, and then you got 52% carrier or diluent or something. I've never seen 100%. Okay, it's rare that you have 100% of any agricultural chemical because
It needs some sort of carrier.
It's got to have some carrier with it. And it has that to facilitate the handling of it. So, back to your original question, I sort of nixed you when I told you couldn't have 100%. Roundup is dose dependent, and that's where I was going a while ago. Because of the 18%, it may cost you $39 for a half a gallon. Where if you're an ag producer are going to use much Roundup, it comes in a 2.5 gallon jug of the 41.9%. And generally you can buy the 2.5 gallon jug, the container itself, somewhere between $50 and $55, as opposed to the 18% that you were paying $38 or $39 for. So it's part of a marketing ploy.
And wouldn't it just be cheaper to buy the materials and make it yourself?
You can't do that.
Yeah.
No. That's multitude of reasons that won't happen.
Oh.
Okay. I'm getting kind of worried about Tyler here being a chemist on us. What was that, Carol?
I said, don't hurt us.
Well, I'm getting a little worried. These little portable labs that you hear in vehicles and so forth. I don't know what he's been making up, but we don't want him to do that. Anyway,
As long as he doesn't head south from Chatham, I'll be okay.
I know, but we're worried about the drift.
Hopefully have enough distance, so.
And Rachel has arrived, so we're good to go.
Yes, she has.
All right. As we talk about formulations and so forth, there are different formulations of all of these materials. Sometimes they'll maintain the same name, same trade name, like what we're talking about with Roundup. Roundup, when it first came on the market, it was a wonder drug, so to speak. They said it would kill everything and long lived and so forth. And at that time, the stuff was available in a 2.5 gallon container. But if I remember correctly, it was about $110 a gallon. So a 2.5 gallon jug is going to run you $220, $250, $260, $260, something like that, for a single 2.5 gallon jug. And they maintained that market price for 10, 12, 14 years until they began to get close to the time when they were going to lose their patent rights. And they recognized that they were going to be in jeopardy with that price point, so they began to reduce it. I remember it went from 110 down to about 89 or 90, and then it came off again to about 55 or 60. But at that time, after the 17 years patent rights were gone, you began to get generics of Roundup, which was called glyphosate. And once that we crossed that threshold of 17 years, it became much more available with the number of generics out, and the price dropped to $30, $35 a gallon. Now, if you are a commercial user, like a lot of the soybean and corn farmers that are in Southside, where you have Roundup ready seeds and Roundup ready production of row crops, these guys are buying Roundup, the 41.9% Roundup, and they'll buy it in 275 gallon totes. The big pallet sized tanks that are white plastic that's got the metal cage around it. And they're buying that stuff at somewhere between $10 and $12 a gallon because of the volume of it that they're using. It's a point of contention with a lot of the environmentalists and the anti-GMO folks and the do-gooders in my eyes. But it is a wonderful tool for us to use, and it's greatly increased the yields and the ability for these farmers to grow a sizable crop with a minimal amount of weed pressure. It's another tool. It's just like your shovel or your hoe. It's you got to know how to use it and how to effectively use it. But it is a grand thing. So.
And Tyler and Amanda, that they're adjusting the price as an example of the anti-competitive pricing we were talking about in the marketing class on Monday.
Exactly.
And we were talking about patent expiration in my law class yesterday. So
yeah,
Monday. So things are coming together.
Yeah, and they're all tied together. As we talk about these different things, you got a cause and effect for all of these things. The things that facilitate the ag business concept that we deal with this. It's supply and demand, and then other pressures that are put on it. So Roundup, just to me, is a real good example of that has taken place during our lifetime that we've been able to see, and it's one that is so easy to use. So we talk about a fumigant. That's a pesticide that forms a toxic vapor or gas when applied. Lots of different types of fumigants. We'll talk about some of those a little later when we go to talk about the application of those. Some fumigants are used in like a bomb, a gas type thing that you hear of them now being used if anybody has a problem with some sort of insect in your home. They've got little, go ahead.
The bomb things that you set off and you just take the cap off.
Foggers.
Yeah, the foggers. I remember when I was a little girl, like, I want to say like 7 years old, and we had dogs and that had gotten fleas, and the flea house got bad, so we used the foggers then.
Yeah, that's an example of a fumigant. One of the first fumigants that I ever used was when I was a tech. I was taking care of the biology greenhouse, and we got a population of whiteflies in there, and whitefly is a little bitty small white fly that's a sucking type insect. We had enough specimen plants in there that I could not spray with any normal type of insecticide because some of them were very sensitive to the insecticides we were using. It would potentially burn them or damage them in some way. So the guy that I was working with said to put off 2 of the foggers or the fumigant bombs. And the ones that we had, they were a metal can that had a screw type top on it that had particulate matter. Actually, the insecticide was in something like sugar that was in the container, except it was a brown pelleted type material. And the way that these had to be put on, you set the fogger on a cement block in the greenhouse, and you adjusted the amount of stuff that you put in, the number of bombs that you put in based on the size of the greenhouse. And the one that I was responsible for, I needed to put in 2 of these bombs. And you would close all the vents, side vents and upper vents, and turn the fans off. And I'd have to take the screw cap off of that and then light a sparkler. One of the old sparklers that kids would use at New Year's, and stick that down into this metal can. And then you had to hustle over and do the same thing on the other one and make sure that all the doors were properly identified and so forth. But once that started to burn, it would be a smoke bomb, basically, that would emit that stuff. And it had a stench like you couldn't believe. It was wretched, the way the stuff smelled. But part of that stench was an indicator to anybody that might come in would recognize that there was something going on in case it wasn't properly marked and so forth. But that's another example of a fumigant. Any of you familiar with strawberry production? The Reese family, which is at Scottsburg, down on the edge of the area where you guys are, grow quite a few strawberries, and they grow them on plastic culture, on plastic mulch beds. And when they're putting that plastic down, they did that back in August for the spring crop. They would also put a fumigant underneath that plastic that's injected from something that looks like a gas tank that you find in your welding shop, except it contains a methyl bromide and chloropicrin. Been a lot of discussion about methyl bromide, and they're about to take that off the market if they haven't already. But that methyl bromide is injected underneath the plastic, and that stays underneath there. It gradually goes away after 2.5, 3 weeks. But that's another fumigant that is used to eliminate the weeds and soil insects that would potentially damage the strawberries. A lot of different fumigants used for different things. We're generally not too readily aware of them. I think there've been a lot of fumigants being used in the recent years where some of these motels and hotels have had problems with bed bugs. You hear about bed bugs that have infected some of these motels and so forth. And they're nearly impossible to get out of a room if you don't use something like a fumigant. So that's another use of a fumigant. Labeling, we've talked about. I'm not going to spend any time on that one. We know what labeling is. Leaching is the movement of a pesticide in the soil or in another liquid, and it's moving downward. It goes downward through the soil or whatever other medium you've got. There are some applications of pesticides that are done in a drenching type manner. In other words, you mix the pesticide with water and you put on a high volume of that solution and it drenches down through the soil. A lot of poinsettias, they have problems with whiteflies and aphids on poinsettias in greenhouses. And but right now is the time that they're really concerned about those because they can greatly affect the poinsettia production that's going to be available for folks come Christmas time. And one of the standard mechanisms of dealing with those insects is to mix a volume of insecticide and apply it in the water that actually leaches down. And it's a systemic type of insecticide that's picked up through the root system and translocated up through the top of those poinsettias. You can't spray much material on a poinsettia because you're concerned about the visual appearance and you don't want to leave any residue, little white droplets where the material might have dried. So that's the mechanism that they use to keep the poinsettias free of insects. Poinsettias are a tough crop to grow. I don't do that. I'm not interested in gaining that skill, but I know enough about it to know what it's like.
With the
The term non-porous, what does non-porous mean to anybody?
Carolyn had a question here.
Material cannot easily pass through it.
Okay. What was your south side? What did you say non-porous was?
Oh no, Carolyn had a question about something.
Okay.
I was just wondering, as far as the leaching and the drenching, the concern about, well water, because a lot of us have well water. And
I can't hear you real well. You're fading away on part of it. Speak up just a little more.
the leaching and the drenching,
Uh-huh.
like how deep it would go down into the ground or get into the well water would be a concern, right?
Carol, you're not going to put on enough of it to carry it down to groundwater.
Okay.
Generally, what you're going to do, if you're leaching or drenching a pot, you're going to have water go all the way through that pot, but it's not going to penetrate more than 3 or 4 inches into the soil.
Okay.
So and the majority of these chemicals that we use are of a type that will affix themselves to soil particles. And I understand your concern, but I don't think it's valid. I don't think you've got anything to worry about with that.
Good.
Good question. Yeah. Now, Tyler, we were talking about non-porous. It means it has no openings or pores to allow a liquid to be absorbed and pass through. That's what we're talking about with non-porous. Most of your dishes that you use at home are non-porous because you don't want food or particulate matter from your table to be retained on your eating utensils or your ware. So that's just an example of non-porous. Or if we talk about non-target is any organism or site that, other than the pest or site that we're applying a control measure to. The example that I was using a while ago with the drift from the chemical that was around the tobacco field, that would be a non-target. That material was applied to the soil, but it drifted to a non-target site. So that's what we're talking about there. Organic matter is material or debris in the soil that began as living plants or animals. That's a little bit of a short definition for that, but it's complete. You know what it is. what we're talking about. And there's a tremendous variation in organic matter among soils. And Carol will find that out when she takes that class next semester. We're talking about organic. PPE, we talked about it earlier. That's just devices and clothing that's used or worn to protect the human body from contacts with pesticides or pesticide residues. And it's not only pesticides. You know, if you're talking about paint application or if you've ever dealt with any asbestos or insulation around the home or fiberglass, you want to use PPE. That's personal protective equipment to protect you from that fiberglass. I hate fiberglass. It eats me alive. Mm-hmm. You know, I've worked with a little bit at insulating my house and so forth, and I'm sure Tom has had some exposure to that.
Oh, yeah.
And it, you know, you've got to use something in the way of materials and clothing and hand gloves and so forth to protect you from that stuff. It's bad news. A pesticide handler or handling, we know what that is. And porous is the next term, and that's the opposite of the non-porous. It's having tiny openings that will allow a liquid to be absorbed or pass through. Porous substances may absorb pesticide readily. And you want to be constantly aware of porous substance when we're using pesticides, because it will create a hazardous situation if you're using that type of material. So.
Is that why a lot of labels say that if any clothing that you're wearing has been heavily soaked in the pesticide, you need to dispose of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because you can't get it out of it. It's just almost impossible, particularly if it's cotton type materials. Some of the synthetics are not quite as, don't have the nature that will allow that to stick to them. But residue is the amount of pesticide that remains in the environment after an application or spill. That's what we're talking about with the poinsettias. You don't want to have a residue from a foliar application of a pesticide on those poinsettias. They're not going to be attractive. You want that poinsettia to have a perfectly clear, bright green leaf and a bright red or white or pink bract that we're talking about. Runoff is the movement of pesticide away from a release site in water or another liquid flowing laterally across the surface. Now, that's one of the things that sometimes creates confusion when we're talking about leaching, runoff, and drift and things of that type. But runoff is the lateral movement of a liquid across the soil or across the surface. It doesn't have to be soil, but it generally is. The storms that occurred Monday evening, I was watching one of the TV stations out of Winston, and they were showing the results of thunderstorms that was in the Boone area. And they had just a river, and it wasn't a normal river, but it was water that was coming down off the hill in Boone, North Carolina, and it had washed some vehicles out of the road. And it was just the lateral movement of water across the roadway. What's a target pest, Tyler?
Target pest is what you want to be killing with a pesticide.
Okay, that's a good one. In here it says the pest towards which a control measure is directed. You know, if it doesn't really have to be a pesticide. If you've got a fly swatter and the fly's there, the fly is the target pest.
Or do you have a shotgun and a deer?
No, well, that could be. It could be. If you're inclined in that direction.
Yeah, if you smack your kids with the fly swatter when you're going after the fly, that would be the non-target.
Yeah.
But that could just be a happy bonus, depending.
That could be collateral damage or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that would work.
That's what we refer to as a.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. As we talk about, the various pesticide decisions that we need to make, first thing it tells you to do is read the label. You know, we harped on that the entire semester, but you know, if you've got a pest problem, and let's say that our pest problem is we've got mites on our azaleas. And mites are a sucking insect that will actually pull or suck the chlorophyll out of a leaf. And your azaleas are beginning to look kind of white, mottly looking. I'm using azaleas because they're on a lot of people familiar with those. They're, you know, ornamental plant in front of the house. And you have a volume of 7 in your cabinet that you have been using on your beans in your garden this summer. And you decide that you want to apply 7 to azaleas to kill your mites that are there. But you go to reading the label, and it's legal to put 7 on azaleas for Japanese beetles, chewing and sucking type insects. But it doesn't say that you've got any insecticidal activity on mites that are on your aphids. I mean, on your azaleas. So, in a compliance with the label, 7 is not labeled to apply on azaleas for mites because it's not effective. You've got to read another label to come up with a material that would be effective on that. So that's what we're talking about with the label. You got to know, make sure that the target pest that you're talking about is going to be affected by the pesticide that you're choosing. Sometimes, you know, it's one of these things that you have to have a lot of knowledge of. You know, we depend on our extension agents to provide a lot of knowledge about these different materials. And when you know, if you're a corn grower, tobacco grower, apple grower, peach grower, whatever, there are usually meetings that are held in each county that will provide you information about, you know, your pests, your pesticide, and the usage of those things. So, but it's all based on what's on that label. Talks about how can I avoid exposure to pesticide. We've talked about that with the PPE and staying out of it, and, you know, things of that type. You know, if you're a larger commercial grower, you're probably going to have equipment that's equipped with calves and so forth to prevent your exposure to that. What preferred personal protective equipment do I need? That's listed on the label. It's going to tell you what you need. Says, is my application equipment ready and safe? Now that's a primary consideration for anybody that begins to apply pesticides. You want to make sure that the equipment that you use is suited to the type of application you're doing. And we'll spend, I think, a lot of time during this next chapter talking about application rates and equipment. We've covered a lot of material for this class already, but we're getting down to some of the nuts and bolts of how you do it. So we'll spend a little more time on that as we move forward. But application equipment is a key to the success of controlling your pests, and it's a key to the safe handling of pesticides. So, I've gotten in trouble a time or two with using the wrong piece of equipment in the wrong conditions. Only made me sick one time, but that I'll always remember that one time that it adversely affected me. Says, how can I avoid accidental pesticide contamination? And that's what I got into. It was an accidental contamination that affected me. I was using the wrong piece of equipment on a windy day, and it pretty well saturated my clothing, and I was using an extremely toxic material. So
But you do.
since I haven't, go. Somebody have a question?
What'd you end up doing? Did you
What
just,
did I end up doing?
yeah,
Scenario was, it was probably the second or third week in March, and we had about a 10-acre field of alfalfa. And at that time of year, we quite often would get a population of alfalfa weevils, which was a little small sucking insect that would come in from the south, and that's about the time we get them. They migrate in on us, and they would, you know, in the course of 2 or 3 days, actually just almost defoliate the alfalfa. And Dad was wanting that high quality alfalfa hay to feed cattle, so happened to be aware that we were beginning to get the infestation of the alfalfa weevils, and the recommended material at that time was Furadan, which was a highly toxic organophosphate. And, you know, we didn't at that time have a real good boom sprayer, but we did have two 500-gallon speed sprayers that we sprayed the orchard with. So Dad said, you know, try to get some Furadan on that alfalfa this afternoon. It being about the third week in March, real calm during the morning, but about the time I got the spray started and went out to put that on shortly after lunch, the wind got up. And as I was, and the speed sprayer, I don't know whether you're familiar with it or not, it's a 500-gallon rig that's got this one had a 350 cubic inch Chevrolet engine in it with a 30-inch fan. And I was putting it out just like we would spray the orchard. In other words, it was blowing about 30 feet in the air, and on 30 feet in the air and about 50 or 60 feet wide as I moved. And as I was going in one direction, wasn't any problem. When I turned and went down the other way, the wind would carry it, and it was lapping over me, and it permeated my shirt and my pants, and was running off the bill of my cap. And you know, I didn't think much about it. I was accustomed to putting that stuff all the time. So I turned and came back, and about the third or fourth pass that I made, I realized that I didn't feel right. And I went on and finished putting that out pretty quickly, but soon went to the house, and my pupils were about the size of the head of a straight pin, and I was losing some of my faculties. I was sort of staggering a little bit, so I got off my contaminated clothes and took a real hot shower and laid down and told my mom what had happened and how I felt. She sort of kept an eye on me. But after I got that material off of me, I soon began to come around. But those type of organophosphates would negatively affect the cholinesterase in your body, which affects the nerve synapse, and that potentially has the potential to poison me. I mean, it was, and I got a pretty good dose of it pretty quickly. But by the fact that I knew what I had used, and what was happening to me, it didn't adversely affect. Now, there's some of those materials that will accumulate in your body and affect your cholinesterase, but I've never gotten any problem with that. Out of 65 years of using pesticides, that's the one time that I had any real negative effects, and it was my own fault because I had misused the material, used the wrong material in the wrong conditions, and got wet. Had I not gotten wet, it wouldn't have bothered anything, but I got dreams just because of the wind and the drift. A speed sprayer throws a lot of water and a lot of material in the air in a real fine particle, and that's what the machine's designed to do, and it doused me pretty well. So I did control the weevils.
Would you say that incident was better or worse than the forklift incident?
Similar. different, but it was similar. Okay, as we talk about pesticide decisions, that's one of the things that you make. Had I been hadn't been pushed, Dad told me to go and do that, and trying to be a good son, I was trying to get that job done. But it was not the best decision of the time to do it. Had I done it early in the morning when the wind was quite calm and quiet, or had I waited until just before dark, again when the wind had died down, it would not have been an issue. But that's a product of a pesticide decision that was done poorly. You need to protect yourself, protect others, and the environment. The environment wasn't an issue in that situation. There was no one else around. But I became, I was the target of the mishandling decisions. But it's always, you got to read labels to make sure that you properly identify your target pest and then using a material that is effective against that pest. And it's, it can be, very specific when you go to looking at these things. You need to know whether that target pest is one that is a chewing insect or a sucking insect, or if it's a disease, you need to know the stage of the development that disease is in, because some diseases are easily controlled at certain stages of their growth cycle. And once they pass that, sometimes you can't control it. Fire blight is one on apples and pears that is fairly easy to control if you get it early. But if it gets into the shoots and so forth, the damage is done. You can't do much about it. So as you're looking at your pesticide decisions, you need to make the proper decision about the material you use. And it makes a difference on the formulation that you're going to use, and the way that you do it. You need to recognize your target site, and that's not hard to do. You know what you're looking at there. The type of equipment that you're using. In the situation with the alfalfa, I used what equipment I had, but it wasn't the best choice under the conditions. If I'd had a boom sprayer, which put the material close to the ground and squirted it directly into the crop, it would not have been an issue. But the machine I was using was filling the air with it and made it subject to drift and my potential contamination. Cost is always a concern, and we talked about that a little bit with the Roundup. But if we're looking at fungicides in today's society, there are a lot of the old fungicides that are used to control plant diseases, and the cost of those varies dramatically. In my grapes, for example, I can control powdery mildew and phomopsis and black rot with a material called wettable sulfur. And when I first started using sulfur, it was about 12 cents a pound. It's up to about 60 cents a pound now. An alternate material that you can use is called Captan or Manzate or Pencazib. Those are in the range of about $4 a pound. You use about 6 pounds of sulfur per acre. You use about 2 pounds of those other materials. So, you're looking at a cost of, $3.60 compared to $8 per acre. And there are a lot of materials now that have come out, and instead of them pricing them by the gallon or by the pound, you buy them by the ounce. And quite often they'll be $5 or $6, $10, $12 per liquid ounce or per dry ounce. But the use rates of those is about an ounce per acre. So cost varies dramatically on the type of material and the crop that you're looking at. And there's no way we can sit in here in the class today and talk about that. Now, I may give you some scenarios if I get time to put them together to let you guys come up with a pesticide tank mix and its cost. Because that's something in some years I've neglected to do just for time, but we've gotten along reasonably well this semester. So I may do that to try to give you a few scenarios, because that's where we're getting to the real crux of this, is being able to make pesticide decisions. So that I think that would be interesting if you all don't mind doing it. I think you gain a lot from it. As we talk about the applications of these materials, air movement is a key factor. In the scenario that I gave you with the furadan and the alfalfa, the air movement caused my problem. But it's always, if you're spraying materials with any sort of air blast equipment, it's nice to have just a little bit of air movement, but you don't want more than 2 or 3 miles an hour. If you've got that 2 or 3 miles an hour, you can use that to your advantage and have it drift away from you when you turn and go back in the next row, rather than have it overlap and become a problem too. There are all sorts of pieces of equipment that are available to evaluate wind speed, and common sense is a better thing to me than having something that tells you that the wind's blowing 12 miles an hour. I've got one of those little anemometers, and it's it's just another tool. All sorts of recommendations in here about avoiding non-target organisms, and that's could be your livestock, your pigs, your cows, anything of that type. You want to avoid drift into non-target organisms. Record keeping we haven't talked about much, but we're going to need to because as we were made aware of when we talked about the different types of license, there's an element of record keeping that's involved with those. If we're talking about private pesticide license, you're required to keep a record of all the restricted use materials that you use. If you've got a commercial license, you've got to keep a record of all the materials that you use. And we'll talk about some of the details with that as we move forward. But that's a quick, dirty discussion about the handling decisions that are made. And I'm going to, like I say, I'm going to try to give you a few scenarios with some possibilities and try to come up with some labels to give you as a sort of a work type assignment to let you know more about it. And we'll use that as a mechanism to get into the application rates and so forth as we move on. Any other questions, concerns? Nothing drifted over you for that one? No.
He's gonna have a baby next year.
He's going to have a what?
A baby.
I don't think so.
Not.
He doesn't look like he's going to have a baby.
No. He's like, I'd be really concerned. You asked for concern. That would be.
Scared, so
We might have to be careful of the drift around him if that's the case.
Yes.
Oh, no.
When is this event to take place?
I don't know. It's news to me.
It's not really happening. She's just messing with him.
Oh, is that all? Well, okay, all right.
we were concerned about the drift. Right. With the kids outside.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's gets back to use of the term we're talking about sensitive areas. That's where people are populated. You just can't do it. And it restricts the use. It'll actually restrict the types of crops that are grown in some areas because of the pesticides that are needed to be put on. And you can say you're growing soybeans up on 3 sides of an elementary school. You could still do that, but you'd want to apply your Roundup at times before the kids got there or well after they left. You know, that would be a mechanism to avoid contamination to that sensitive area. You know, it all boils down to common sense. You know, and some of us are not blessed with a lot of that, so we have to talk about it. So, it's a never-ending process.
Common sense isn't that common.
So, the meetings that you brought up for like local areas, as far as, just finding out what pesticide control is working and what
Yeah.
being, as far as being legal and what they're like taking out or putting in. Do you have to have your commercial applicator's license to attend those meetings?
No. What I'm talking about would be say in your area, it would be a general production meeting for the tobacco farmers. And they would be talking about the varieties and the cultural practices and so forth. And quite often there would be a small segment of that meeting that was devoted to pesticides and things of that type. And generally, when they have that component of the pesticides in there, you would gain some continuing education points for your pesticide license, for your private applicator's license.
Yeah.
When I maintained the chemical business at home, I had a commercial business license, and I had to have additional educational units every 2 years for that one. And there wasn't anything in our immediate area. So what I would end up doing, every other year, I would drive to Blackstone and sit in on a 6 or 7 hour meeting that they had for tobacco farmers there. But that would gain me the continuing education points that I needed to continue to have my commercial applicator business license.
Okay.
When we were growing apples, there is a meeting that they would hold between the Patrick and Carroll County apple growers. At that time, at one time there were over 200 of those. It's down now to about 30 in both counties. But they hold a meeting in the spring, and just to introduce the new chemicals and new things that are going on. And in that situation, you could gain continuing education points for your private applicator's license. You got to do that to, attend something every other year to maintain that license, unless you want to go and be retested. Nobody wants to do that. So, those meetings are available to provide opportunities for that. If you ever, when we get to the point you got your license, if you got a question about it, all you got to do is call the county extension agent, and they can tell you where you can go and get your continuing ed points. So it's not rocket science. It's easy.
I think I might call you as well.
That's fine. I'll be glad to help.
All
I'll be
right.
glad to help.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Yep, I'm done. Y'all have a good evening.
Okay, bye.
See you in an hour.
See the lucky of y'all in a couple hours.
Yes.
All right.